Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the author of Hibernate Made Easy, the webmaster of hibernate.cfg.xml, and the author of a couple of other interesting Java and Sun certification resources. So if you're in the market, I'd appreciate if you headed over to Amazon and picked up a couple of those. One of the things I wanted to talk about in this tutorial was how you can actually create a Java component, a Java bean, and have that Java bean mapped to a database table and have Hibernate manage the persistence of that particular POJO. As you can see, I've actually installed the JDK, MySQL, some GUI tools, even downloaded all of the required JDBC drivers, Hibernate Core, Hibernate Annotations, and put all the pertinent libraries inside a folder called _hiblib. Now what I'd like to do right now is actually I'm going to create a new folder called _mycode. And in that particular folder I'm going to create a new folder called com, a new folder called exam scam, and a new folder in there called model. And in that model folder, I'm going to create a new Java file called user.java. And this particular file is going to be used to do just that, model a Java component called a user. Now, I've got to say that this is in the package com.examscam.model, or it's not going to compile. It's a public class. It's going to be called user. And you can have as many properties as you want in your user class. I'm just going to keep it simple now. I'm going to have a private long called ID and a private string called password. Just basic properties. You can list as many as you like. It's up to you how you want to actually code your application. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some setters in here. So public get ID, public long get ID, return ID, public void set ID. Now one thing I like to tell people to always use the uppercase wrapper class types when you're declaring your variables. So in this case I've used a long, uppercase L long. If you're using an integer, make sure it's uppercase I integer, not just the primitive type int. So I got my getters for ID and long get password. Of course that's a string. Return password. String password this dot. There we go. I think that all looks good. Now hopefully that particular file would compile, and if I'm not going to compile that right now. I'm going to take on faith that this would all compile. But essentially this is just a regular POJO, a user class, couple of properties. You can have as many properties as you want, one of type long, one of type string. Got your typical setters and getters in this file as well, as you would expect in any Java class. The formatting's not too great, but I'm using Notepad. Give me a break. Now I want Hibernate to manage the persistence of this object. In fact, I want Hibernate to create a database table where it can store information about users, where it can store users' ID and store users' password. And if I want Hibernate to do that, I have to add a little annotation that says this particular user class is an entity. And not only is this particular user class an entity, but the ID value there is actually the primary key that we're going to use for this class. So ID, I put a little annotation on top of it, the @ID annotation. Also, the ID is going to have its number. The unique primary key is going to be generated by the database. In this case, it's going to be generated by MySQL. And so I can also put a little annotation on here that tells Hibernate, you know what, I've got a little primary key here. ID is the ID to be used for the user class, and the database is going to generate the unique primary key for me. And so this is a POJO, and as you can see, it's decorated slightly with some Hibernate and JPA annotations. And of course, if you want to do that, you also have to add the pertinent import. So I'm going to do an import javax.persistence .star, and I could do .entity, .generated value, .id, but that will cover all of them. Not a big fan of using the asterisk, but in this case it should work pretty good. Now, this particular code here, this is how you sort of code your POJO, but what I want to do is I want to make this class runnable as well. And when I run this class, I'm actually going to have Hibernate create the database tables that are required in order to support the persistence of instances of the user class, whether that means pulling instances out of the database, updating them, creating new ones, even deleting them. I want Hibernate to create the underlying table that's going to be required to do persistence. And so that means putting in a main method here, so public static void main string args. And then coding a couple of interesting lines of code in here. Now, whenever you're working with Hibernate, you have to create a Hibernate configuration object. And if you're using annotations, you use an annotation configuration object. Let's call it config. So there we go. I create my annotation configuration object. And when you have an annotation configuration object, what you need to do is you need to add all of your JPA annotated classes to the configuration object. And right now I've only got the user class, but I add that in, and then I tell the config object to configure it itself. And in that case, when it configures it itself, it's actually going to go to a special XML file and figure out how to connect to the underlying database and what the username and password is and all those other wonderful things. Now, after I've got that configured configuration object, one of the things I can do with it is I can pass it to this thing called a SchemaExport class. And when I pass the config object, which knows about all the different objects that it's managing, POJOs whose persistence it's managing, when I pass the config object to the SchemaExport class and call the create method, passing 2 true Boolean values, what happens is the SchemaExport class will first print out the SQL required to create the underlying database to support the persistence of these classes, and the second true will tell it to actually execute that SQL against the database to actually create the required database tables. And so this is all that I need to code in order to, well, create a POJO and then have Hibernate create the database tables, the underlying database tables that are needed to support the persistence of my POJOs. Now, I said there is actually an XML file that's used to tell Hibernate how to connect to the underlying database. Well, that configuration file is the hibernate config.xml file, and it's actually it's an XML file. It has to be well formed, and if you mess it up, you're in a lot of trouble. So when people are writing their Hibernate config files, you don't want to start from scratch. You want to find a sample one. So if you go into the Hibernate core download and go into the documentations folder, I think under reference, maybe under tutorial, and under source, there you go. You'll see a hibernate config.xml file. Even a log4j.properties file as well, which you'll want to copy. Throw into your my code folder right there, and of course we want to edit it because we're actually getting one from the Hibernate download. It's not set up to support MySQL or my database or my password or anything like that. So as you can see, the database driver class right off the bat isn't correct for us. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to fix that up, and of course our database driver class is going to be com.mysql.jdbc.driver. So I'm going to make that little change there. com.mysql.jdbc.driver. The connection URL is a little bit different for MySQL. It's jdbc://localhost/examscam, with examscam being the name of the database schema that we have set up inside of MySQL. I think the username is root. I don't think there's a password, but it might just be password, so I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not using a connection pool, so I'm actually going to get that connection pool property out of there. The dialect, of course, is an org.hibernate.hsqld dialect. It's actually the dialect for MySQL, so it's org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect. We'll put the session in the thread. That's good for me. We won't be using a second level cache. We will echo out all of the SQL. We will not recreate the database every time the code runs. We don't want Hibernate to do that. We can control that through the SchemaExport. And of course, we don't have any mapping files because we use annotations. So I'm just going to save that, take a quick look at it. But indeed, that actually looks like it is a good hibernate.cfg.xml file for my application. I'm a little worried about the password there. Again, emphasizing it's in the My Code folder, right with com, exam, scam, and model. And with that file created, and with the hibernate.config.xml file created, and the user class created, the next thing we have to do is just compile our code and see if it runs.